we had two resolutions at the UN, but both of them were vetoed by the US. The reason that the US foreign policy is vetoing these resolutions, they're talking about these resolutions would benefit Hamas. And we remember that for the Ukraine war, they were suggesting that if we start negotiating with Russia, it would benefit Russia. It seems to me the same policy is going on and on.
I see these issues somewhat differently. For me, I am focused on two realities. The first reality is that, as a journalist, a famous journalist once said, the first casualty in every war is the truth. You can't believe anybody. Everybody is lying. Everybody is playing to their own audience, trying to position themselves. Mr. Biden, is running for re-election. Mr. Netanyahu is basically trying to stay out of jail. The leadership of Hamas has its political problems. And mostly they're dealing with those kinds of issues. And you don't know the details. You never do. And now people's lives are at stake. I'm horrified by, what Hamas did. I'm horrified by what the Israelis are doing. It is, I am the product. My mother was German. My father was French. They were both driven out of Europe by World War II. So I'm an American because they came here to the United States. But I speak French and German, and I always have, because I grew up in that kind of a family. And for me, war and destruction solve nothing. The second thing I bring is I'm a historian. I've always taught history. I study history. This is a conflict that is now 75 years old, and at least, and it hasn't been resolved. The United States has been the dominant global power since Israel was formed as a state after World War II. And so the United States has been the dominant player in any global effort to solve the problem of Palestine, Israel, in the context of the Middle East. And that effort by the United States is a failure. That's what this shows us. It did not work. And we know it from the 1967 war, and we know it from the warfare in 73, and many, many problems all between. There's never really been a peace. There are basic minimum issues that the Palestinians bring to the table. There are basic minimum issues that the Israelis bring to the table. And there has to be a compromise between these, or else we're going to have what we have. We're going to have endless war. And the only new thing is the fact that the global situation has now changed. And that's very important. The United States is weaker than at any time in the history of Israel. And the Israelis must surely understand this. And the enemies of Israel, the Palestinians, and if you want to think this way, the broader Arab community, or maybe even the broader Islamic community, is stronger than it has been at any time. And that's a very important difference. And the Israelis don't seem to me, to be able to come to terms with this new reality. And the United States doesn't want to come to terms with it either. For me, the most horrific moment in the last week was a statement by Janet Yellen, the US Treasury Secretary, who said publicly that the United States can afford, her word, can afford 2 wars at the same time. That is an unbelievably ignorant thing to say. You can never afford a war. You can never afford one war. You can never afford a war that you are losing, which the United States is in Ukraine. I mean, it's spectacular to watch. It's not at all clear that Israel will prevail. In Gaza, probably. But in the north, with Hezbollah, not so clear. With Iran and Saudi Arabia, not so clear. And the new global hegemon is China anyway. And where does that play into all of this? This is a very, very dangerous, very, very dangerous, not so much because of Palestinians and Israelis, although that's the flashpoint, but it's really the changing global situation, which you and I have discussed, that has to be brought into the story. So if you ask what I favor, my first thing, of course, is a ceasefire. Stop the bombings, stop the rockets, stop the killing, stop all of that, and have the world insist, put United Nations peacekeepers on the border or whatever is necessary to enforce a ceasefire, and then have the United States, China, Russia, and all that put together a conference that has to come up, however difficult and however long it takes, with an agreement that the world as a whole will enforce. We've never had that quite, and it's something we need to try again. I understand it will be difficult. I understand that both the Palestinians and the Israelis will make it difficult, but I don't see what the alternative is.
Here in Brazil, we have this struggle between right and left. If you remember, we had a president called Bolsonaro. He was far right and he was making fun of Lula. He was talking about that these are communists. They want to make Brazil like Venezuela, Cuba. And just recently, Lula said they called us communists, as though they're calling us Nazis. We are not. We are proud to be communists. We are not Nazis. There is a totally misunderstanding on the right side about the left. What's going on with the Biden administration in the United States? I talk with some people who are the far right in the US, and they're talking what we are seeing in the Biden administration, the problems that we are seeing in the Biden administration are coming from the left. Why there is a tremendous amount of hatred against the left? What's the problem? Why we cannot communicate? They're not willing to have a dialogue.
They don't think they need to. Look, the answer to this question is history. There is no other way to understand what you're seeing in the Biden administration and the Democratic Party leadership, Obama, Clinton, Biden, all of that. That's all the same Democratic Party of the last 70 years. It is a product, above all else, of the Great Depression of the 1930s and the post-World War II economic and political program of reaction against what happened in the 1930s. That's the United States. Those two events, the Great Depression of the 1930s and the post-World War II rollback of the New Deal, the progressive program of the 90s, that's American history. It's all a historical reality. You know, and that's not peculiar to the United States. The history of this country produced both the Democratic Party of today and the Republican Party of today, both Bernie Sanders on the left and Donald Trump on the right. It is easy, if you give me the time, I can take the next 15 minutes and I can show you how that history creates the politics of our time now.
Go ahead.
Okay. The story begins in 1929, in October, when the global capitalist system crashes. Let's remember, it was the worst crash in the history of capitalism in its 4 or 5 centuries of arriving on this planet. Okay. In 1933, here in the United States, the official unemployment rate hit 25%. 1 out of 4 American workers had no job. And what that means is every American family was affected by that unemployment. Either your father, your mother, your sister, your uncle, your cousin, somebody was unemployed, often many, which meant that the few that still had jobs had to share their income with the unemployed. Because remember, between 1929 and 1933, if you lost your job, you got nothing. There was no unemployment insurance. There was no backstopping for you. You would go to the local church and stand in line and maybe get a bowl of soup, but you could barely take care of yourself, and you couldn't help anyone. Unspeakable situation. And there had been no preparation for that. The United States had already been in a period of economic growth, roughly from the end of the Civil War, 1860s, to the Great Crash. They had thought that somehow economic well-being, economic growth was guaranteed. The 1920s had been very prosperous, and the First World War was not fought in the United States, so the horrible destruction of the war didn't happen here. It happened in Europe, which is again what happened in World War II. So it came as a complete shock, a complete unexpected catastrophe in the 1930s. And let's remember, the Great Depression begins in October of 1929 and goes at least until 1941. So you're talking 11, 12 years of depression, the worst in the history of capitalism. All right. In that situation, the American working class did something very unexpected. It went to the left. Politically, it went to the left. In a very short time, tens of millions of American workers joined labor unions. These are people who had never been in a labor union before. These are people whose parents had never been in a labor union. And they joined something called the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, in mass industries, the auto industry, the same union that's on strike right now in the United States, the United Auto Workers, was on strike back then. But then it was a strike to form the union, and it was very, very successful, but in all the other basic industries. And alongside the unionization drive, there were 3 organizations that worked with the unions, moving the country to the left. There was the United States Socialist Party. There was the Socialist Workers' Party, which is a Trotskyist offshoot. And then there was the American Communist Party. All 3 of them were large, tens of thousands of members, and powerful. And they worked together with the CIO. They had their tensions, they had their conflicts, but they were allies. And together they formed the New Deal coalition. CIO, 2 socialist parties, 1 communist party. Here's what they achieved. Number 1, a social security pension system had never existed in the United States, was formed in the depths of the Depression. 1933-34, these workers, mobilized by the socialists and the communists and the unions, went to the president of the United States, and they said to him, named Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, you have to do something for the millions and millions of people that are unemployed and that are suffering. Total GDP went down in these years. It wasn't a question of economic growth. It was a question of economic decline, fairly rapid. Okay. And these workers said to the president, you must do something for us, because if you don't, we will not vote for you again, and you will be a one-term president. But if you help us, we will become strong for you. Okay? And the president made the decision, even though he comes from a wealthy family who had already had a president from their family earlier, Theodore Roosevelt, some years earlier. And he said, I will give you benefits. I will help the working class through the Depression, but you have to stop talking about socialist revolution. Many socialists and communists didn't want to do that, but they were the minority. The majority of the labor movement and of the socialists and of the communists were agreeable to do that. It was a decision to favor reform over revolution. So a deal was made. And Roosevelt then had to deliver his promise. Not because he's honorable, he wasn't, but because he knew that if he didn't, he wouldn't be president very much longer. So first, Social Security. If you reach the age of 65, you will get a check from the government every month for the rest of your life until you die. In one act, every working class family relaxed because their older parents, who may be sick, who may be infirm, would now be taken care of by the government. And it was spectacular. Okay? There'd never been anything like that in the United States. There'd never been a serious effort to even try to get it in the United States. And this coalition, the New Deal coalition, got it. Number two, Roosevelt set up the unemployment compensation system. If you lose a job, and remember, at that time, there were tens of millions of unemployed people, you will get a check from the government every week for somewhere between half a year and 2 years to help you through your period of unemployment. We had never had that before on the federal level in the United States. Number three, 1938, established the first minimum wage. And if you adjust for prices, it was higher then in real terms than it is today. So it was a much more meaningful floor under which wages could not go. And number four, a government jobs program for roughly 12 to 15 million unemployed people who got a job with the government and a proper income. Okay, this was in the midst of a depression where the government had no money because everybody was unemployed, didn't pay taxes. Companies were bankrupt, didn't pay taxes. So where did the money come from to pay Social Security checks, unemployment checks, and wages to the government jobs that were created? Answer: Roosevelt taxed corporations and the rich on a scale never before seen in the United States. In 1944, to give you an example, in 42 to 44, Roosevelt did two things that most people don't know. Number one, he issued a new Bill of Economic Rights, a new Bill of Rights, which guaranteed people jobs and income. It was very much a socialist program. Wasn't called that, but that's what it was. And the second thing he did was to raise taxes. For example, he proposed on one of his State of the Union messages, every year in January, the president gives a speech about the state of the economy. And he delivers to the Congress his program for the year. And in that year, I don't remember, was it 43 or 44, his proposal was for income tax at the highest level, 100%. Let me explain so everybody understands what that means. Anybody who earned in that year over $25,000 per year, every dollar over $25,000 that you earned, the government tax rate would be 100%. In other words, that was a maximum income. You couldn't earn more. Today, that would be about $400,000 a year. We have thousands and thousands of millionaires in the United States who earn more than $1 million a year, and they would have had to pay big income taxes. Below that, and by the way, when he proposed that to the Congress, the Republican Party denounced it. The Democratic Party was lukewarm, and they ended up with a compromise. Roosevelt didn't get 100%. He got 94%. Every dollar over 25,000 you earned, you got to keep 6 cents, and the other 94 cents went in taxes to the government. Okay, last step. In World War II, the danger to the United States was considered to be Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, and Japan. Therefore, the United States entered into an alliance with the Soviet Union, the only socialist country in the world. If you went to a post office here in the United States in those years to get some stamps to send, Christmas card to your grandmother, you would see a picture of Uncle Sam arm in arm with Uncle Joe. That stood for Joseph Stalin, because we were allies. Okay, that means that the New Deal was an unprecedented attack on corporations and the rich, who were taxed at altogether new high levels, in order to raise money that was used to help the working class with pensions, with minimum wages, with jobs, and with unemployment insurance. It went against everything that the ruling class of capitalists could imagine. They were taxed more to help the working class. It was unbearable. Therefore, one more thing. Because Roosevelt did what the New Deal coalition demanded, the working class in America became ferociously democratic, anti-Republican, pro-Roosevelt. Roosevelt was reelected 3 times. No president in American history, all the way back to George Washington, had ever been reelected 3 times. The most socialistic president of the United States was by far the most popular president this country ever had. And that is true to this minute. No one ever came close. When Roosevelt died in 1945, and the Second World War ended, The capitalist class in the United States was unified more than it had ever been. And the unity was built around undoing what Roosevelt had done. Because Roosevelt called his program the New Deal, the post-World War commitment was to undo the New Deal. And the way this was done was by ending the alliance with the Soviet Union, dropping 2 atomic bombs in Japan to let the Soviet Union know what the United States was willing to do if it felt the need to do it. Number 3, destroy the New Deal coalition. Because the problem was never Roosevelt. He only did what he did because he was forced to by a movement from below. So they had to destroy, and they made the communists and the socialists into the evil agents of the Soviet Union. Communism became a program to kill babies, to destroy religion, everything you could say. They arrested communists. They imprisoned communists. They deported, forced communists out of the United States and back to European or Asian countries that they had come from. It got the name McCarthyism because of one of the senators who led that process. The big business and the Christian churches and the mainline other religions, they went on a crusade against everything that the New Deal had accomplished. Everything was called an evil communist plot. They didn't care whether you were a Democratic Party or a liberal or an intellectual or a professor. It didn't make any difference. If you supported what had been done in the 1930s, you were the evil enemy of the United States. For these people, Roosevelt and Stalin were equally horrible. And all of the arguments like that were made then, and they are being recycled now. But if you know the history, you will shake your head that there's nothing new here at all. When Donald Trump refers to the Democratic Party as communists or Marxists, it's silly, it's childish, and it's ignorant. But who cares? It's American politics that makes those people comfortable about saying and repeating, because what they're doing is saying and repeating the real history of the United States. The fact that it's inaccurate, nobody really cares about that, because you have cultivated in the American people for 75 years the idea that everything about Soviet Union, about socialism, about communism, about welfare state, about social democracy, it's all the same thing. Americans don't understand the difference between a socialist, a communist, an anarchist, a Marxist. For it's all the same. They cannot, no one has ever taught them and what the differences here are. And they crushed it. They have crushed it ideologically, politically. The only reason, let me be very personal. The only reason you know me and you bring me on this program to have a discussion with you is because I am a product of the elite universities in the United States, so you have heard it. But when I raised my hand at Harvard or at Yale or at Stanford, and I asked questions about socialism, my professors either said to me, if they were honest, I don't know, or they said to me, if they were dishonest, that's not an appropriate question. And that's not, by the way, because they were always ignorant. They weren't. Some of these people knew, but they knew it would end their career if they became known as the professor who knew a lot about socialism. So they never learned. They never read Karl Marx. I had to learn and teach capitalist economics, but the critique of capitalism, I had to learn on my own. And to teach it, which I'm doing now, I had to have the protection of the pedigree university that allows me to function in ways it does not allow most others. So if you're frustrated today, you're frustrated at a society that has paid a terrible price. And let me conclude on this point with that price. The people now running the government, and I mean the George Bushes, the Donald Trumps, the Bill Clintons, the Joe Bidens, this is an entire generation of people who have no idea what anti-capitalism means. They don't know the arguments. They don't know the evidence. They have no idea. The hostility here to those things was so deep and so bitter that otherwise intelligent people were proud that they never read a word of Karl Marx, that Lenin is a butcher, that Lenin wrote the best history of the economy of Russia that we have in the English language, or certainly one of the 3 or 4 best. They don't even know that. No president in the United States writes a book worth reading, never has. But Lenin did. Lenin was a serious thinker. For most Americans, they have no idea. They proudly became ignorant. And what that means is all of the history of socialism, the successes that socialists have had, the failures that socialists have never been studied, have never been investigated to learn something. The failures were used to say, see, socialism is terrible. So you learn nothing. And that's why the mistakes are being made. That's why there's a BRICS now that undoes American hegemony. They don't know what to do. That's why they're losing the war in Ukraine. That's why they're probably going to lose whatever emerges in the Middle East. Look, as I have explained before, the G7 is the United States and its major allies, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Canada, and Japan. The G7 are now produce 29% of the world's output, right? The BRICS produce between 33 and 35% of the world's output. It's over. American dominance economically is gone. It's not coming back. This year, the United States will have a gross GDP increase, maybe 2%. The Chinese will have 5%. Okay, there it is again. Despite the COVID-19, despite everything else, there is the reality. You know, Saudi Arabia, which is a capitalist country, is now working more closely with China than it is with anybody else, even though they had the best possible deal from the United States. These are all signs. There was going to be a summit of Arab countries in Jordan last week, and they invited President Biden to address the assembled Arab leaders. When he gave his speech in the United States and when he gave his speech in Tel Aviv, they canceled the conference. They told him he was not welcome to come. What? Each of these things is small, but to put them all together, yeah, you have to recognize when I speak in the United States, I have to explain to my audiences what socialism is, because they don't know. The young people are honest and say, what is it? We don't know. The older people tell me we know what it is, and then tell me what it was back in the days of the Soviet Union, and they have no idea how socialism has changed, how it has diversified. They just don't, and I have to explain. You know, socialism now exists in every country on earth. 200 years ago, nobody ever heard of socialism. In 2 centuries, it went from a small part of Western Europe to a global movement. It has been interpreted in different ways by the people of Nigeria, or the people of Iran, or the people of Mexico, or there's loads of socialisms. If you want to understand, you have to understand all that. China defines itself as socialism with Chinese characteristics. The government of Portugal today is a coalition of the Portuguese Socialist Party, together with the Portuguese Communist Party, together with the Portuguese Green Party. That's the government. Americans, when I tell them that, look at me, and they have no idea what I'm talking. This is all news for them. We do not tell our people, and it has become normal. The same professor will give a lecture about how we in America believe in the open marketplace of ideas. And he means it. He really means it. Because he has been carefully educated simply not to know all of the evidence that makes that silly to say, childish, ignorant on a level that's embarrassing. And I don't want to embarrass these people, but I have really no choice. I'm going to send you, when we're done today, I'm going to send you an article that I recently wrote that's being published all over the world about socialism. And I think you may find it of some help, because it tries to organize, and it's short, you know, it's 1,500 words or something like that. Anyway, I'm sorry to take so long, but that's why you have the crazy politics in the United States. It is this combination of having lived in a bubble of self-referential hegemony and not understanding the criticisms and where they come from and where they're rooted. And now, because the American hegemony is fading, because American capitalism has one problem after another. I mean, try to understand, the crash of 2008 and 9 was the second worst crash after the one in the 1930s. We also had a crash in the beginning of the year 2000, the so-called dot-com crash. And now we had one in 2020 and 2021, the so-called COVID-19 crash. It's too much. And then we had COVID. And then we have an inflation. And then we have rising interest rates. You are hammering your working class, and eventually the working class is going to say, no more. And you're seeing it already. That's why some of them vote for Trump. They don't like him. They don't trust him. They know he's a billionaire who could care less about them. But they hate the old Republican and Democratic Party machines. The Democrats like Biden and Clinton, they are the product of the post-World War II anti-left. The only way they could hold on to be Democrats was by saying, we're a different kind of Democrat. We're not Roosevelt. We're not progressive. We're not socialistic. We don't want high taxes. We don't. And they hate the idea of Bernie Sanders or Ocasio-Cortez or any of the others because they sound a little like Franklin Roosevelt. Not even very much, just a little. They hate that because they're terribly afraid that anything like that will be squashed by the business community in the United States, the way the left was squashed after World War II. They live in that fear. And that has allowed the politics to go step by step further to the right because the Democrats are afraid. Eventually, the Democratic Party will split, just the way the Republican Party is now splitting. And you'll see the left emerge there. And you can even see it already with Bernie, with Ocasio-Cortez. But this year, pay attention to the presidential race of Cornel West. That is the American left. It is large, it is strong, but it is terribly disorganized.